Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're really getting into the mind of Immanuel Kant, specifically his evolving ideas on religion.
That's right. We've got this great source text, Immanuel Kant, Philosophia da Religione, which traces his thinking over, well, his entire career, pretty much.
Yeah, it's a comprehensive look, and our mission today is really to unpack that journey, how he shifted from, early rationalist ideas about God to some really quite radical thinking later on.
Exactly. We're talking about nearly half a century of wrestling with these questions, from his first lectures right up to stuff he wrote after retiring.
And Kant's background is important here, isn't it? He grew up in a very religious environment.
Oh, absolutely. Deeply pietist household. And even though he kind of stepped back from public religious life later, that focus on faith, on morality, it stuck with him. He was always trying to figure out where religious belief fits, in human thought and action.
Okay, so the trajectory, broadly speaking, starts with rational arguments for God, then a big shift where he says we can't actually know God through pure reason,
The big one, yeah.
which leads to this moral basis for belief.
Right. A practical necessity almost.
And finally, God gets tied really closely to moral duty itself.
And that huge turning point the source makes clear is his critique of pure reason. That's where you get that famous line about needing to deny knowledge in order to make room for faith.
Which sounds counterintuitive, but he wasn't ditching knowledge, was he?
No, not at all. He was still all in on empirical science. But he drew a line. He said, look, what we can know for sure is limited to what we can experience. Things like God. They're beyond that line. They're in the realm of what we can rationally believe or have faith in. A really radical move.
Okay, let's rewind a bit then. Talk about those early influences. What was feeding into his thinking before the critiques?
Well, that pietist background is definitely number one. It wasn't just like going to church. It was intense personal devotion, scripture study, a real focus on Christian ethics, on educating people to be virtuous.
So a strong moral compass from the start.
Definitely. And even though he personally drifted from organized religion, that ethical core, that emphasis on inner conviction, it totally shaped his later philosophy.
And he was also living through a scientific revolution, right? Newton's ideas were changing everything.
Oh, yeah, massively.
Yeah.
As a student, Kant was a big Newtonian science guy. He even contributed himself with his nebular hypothesis in universal natural history and theory of the heavens.
Trying to explain the solar system forming naturally.
Exactly. Which immediately raises this tension, doesn't it? How does this mechanistic scientific picture fit with, well, religious doctrine about creation? It's an early sign of that core project, reconciling reason and faith.
And the philosophical scene at the time, it was pretty divided.
Very much so. You had the continental rationalists, think Descartes, Leibniz, Wolff, who believed in innate ideas, stuff we're born knowing, and that pure reason could grasp God's existence, using things like the ontological argument.
Okay, reason gets you there.
Then you had the British empiricist Locke, Hume, saying, no, hold on. All knowledge comes from our senses, from experience. They tended to look at things like the cosmological or teleological arguments, though often pretty skeptically.
Right, arguments from the world around us. And Kant initially leaned towards the rationalists.
He did, yeah. His teachers were big on Wolff, so that Leibnizian Wolffian framework was his starting point. His early writings show him thinking, yes, logic can lead us to metaphysical truths, including understanding God.
But then someone came along and shook things up.
David Hume. Oh, yeah. Hume's skepticism, especially about causality and whether we can know anything beyond our senses, really hit Kant hard. It sort of pulled the rug out from under that confidence in pure reason.
Must be quite a jolt.
Imagine thinking you can reason your way to God, then Hume asks, okay, but where's the experience of God? Suddenly, the ground wasn't so solid.
So what did those pre-critical arguments actually look like before Hume rattled his cage?
Well, in the universal natural history, he looks at the universe's order and says, okay, that points to a divine cause. Simple enough.
Like an early design argument.
Kind of. Then in the new exposition, he argues God's existence is necessary for anything else to possibly exist. God as the ground of possibility.
Getting a bit more abstract.
Definitely. And then in the one possible basis, he tries to really nail down God as the unconditioned condition for everything. But interestingly, he's already skeptical about the traditional proof, the ontological, cosmological, teleological. He thinks they don't quite work.
Even before the critiques. Interesting.
Yeah, even then he seemed to think belief in God was essential, but maybe a rock-solid logical proof wasn't the be-all and end-all.
Okay, so he's wrestling with it. Then boom, the critiques land. This is the revolution. Let's start with the big one, the critique of pure reason. What's the core idea?
It really is a philosophical earthquake. Kant rolls out his transcendental method. It's this amazing middle path between rationalism and empiricism. He's, okay, empiricists, you're right. All knowledge begins with experience.
Senses give us the raw data.
But rationalists, you're also kind of right. Our minds actively structure that data using pre-existing frameworks, what he calls a priori structures.
Yeah.
Not innate ideas, but innate ways of organizing experience.
Like the operating system for our brain.
That's a decent analogy, yeah. Things like time, space, causality, they aren't in the world we experience. They're the lenses through which we experience it. They're conditions for experience itself.
Which leads to that famous quote,
"Thoughts without content are empty. Intuitions without concepts are blind." You need both the raw sense data, intuitions, and the mental concepts to make sense of it. One without the other is useless for knowledge.
And the big implication for God and metaphysics.
Huge. Kant says, look, traditional metaphysics tries to talk about things totally outside any possible experience, the soul, the whole cosmos, God. But our mental toolkit, those categories like causality, existence, substance, they're designed only for organizing sensory experience.
You can't apply them beyond that realm.
Exactly. Trying to use them to know things like God is like trying to use a hammer to drive a screw. Wrong tool for the job. We just can't have theoretical knowledge of these transcendent things.
So are ideas like God just meaningless then, if we can't know them?
Not at all. This is crucial. He makes a distinction. Constitutive versus regulative. Concepts based on experience constitute our knowledge of the world. But these big metaphysical ideas, God, freedom, immortality, they have a vital regulative function.
They guide us.
Precisely. They act like ideals, like guiding stars for our reason and our actions. Think about his postulates of practical reason, God, freedom, immortality. We can't prove them scientifically, but Kant argues it's rational, even necessary, to assume them, to postulate them, as a matter of rational faith.
A belief we need to make sense of our moral lives, maybe.
That's exactly where he's heading. They regulate our thinking, especially about morality and ultimate meaning, even if they don't give us objective knowledge in the scientific sense.
And this framework lets him dismantle those traditional proofs for God's existence, right? The ontological, cosmological, teleological.
Oh, systematically, he takes them apart. The teleological, the argument from design. He says, okay, maybe it points to some kind of intelligent designer, but it doesn't get you to an all-powerful, necessary God. For that, you'd need the cosmological argument.
Which argues from cause and effect back to a first cause.
Right. But Kant says, hey, causality is a category we apply within experience. You can't just leap outside experience and apply it to find a cause for existence itself. That's an illegitimate move.
And the ontological argument, defining God into existence.
He famously argues that existence isn't a real predicate. It's not a property like blue or heavy that something can possess. Saying God exists doesn't add anything to the concept of God. It just posits that the concept corresponds to something real. You can't build existence into the definition.
So you can define a perfect island, but that doesn't mean it exists somewhere.
Exactly that. The whole project of proving God through pure thought, through theoretical reason alone, Kant says it's built on sand.
Okay, wow. So theoretical knowledge of God is out. But then he pivots to practical reason, in the critique of practical reason. How does he build belief back up on moral grounds?
Yeah, the focus shifts entirely. It's not about what we can know, but about what we must do, about our moral duties. Kant starts with our innate sense of morality, the categorical imperative, this unconditional command to act ethically.
Do the right thing because it's the right thing.
Pretty much. And he argues we have a duty not just to be virtuous, but to strive for the highest good, a state where happiness is perfectly proportional to virtue.
The ultimately fair outcome.
Right, but then he looks around and says, well, in this life, that doesn't seem to happen automatically, does it? Good people suffer, bad people prosper. Our own efforts don't guarantee that perfect alignment.
Seems unlikely, yeah.
So Kant argues, for morality to be fully rational and meaningful, for this highest good to be even possible, we have to postulate two things, God and immortality.
Why those two?
We need to believe in an afterlife, immortality. So there's enough time, let's say, for this perfect balance of virtue and happiness to be achieved. And we need to believe in God as a kind of ultimate guarantor, a power capable of bringing about this just state of affairs, aligning happiness with moral worth.
So belief in God isn't proven, but it's a necessary assumption for our moral framework to make sense.
Exactly. It's a postulate of practical reason. It's something we need to believe to sustain our commitment to the moral law and the pursuit of the highest good. It gives morality an ultimate coherence,
And that leads to his definition of religion.
as the recognition of all duties as divine commands. See how practical it is. Religion becomes fundamentally about ethics, about seeing our moral obligations as having this ultimate divine authority. It's not about knowing God's essence, but about living rightly.
Okay, and the third critique, the critique of judgment. Does that add much to the religion picture?
Primarily, it's about aesthetics and purpose in nature, but in an appendix, he talks about moral teleology. He revisits the idea of purpose, but links it to our moral ends.
Purpose in the universe aligned with morality.
Sort of. He suggests that to see nature as ultimately compatible with our moral goals, it's reasonable to think of God not just as some abstract principle, but as a personal God, a moral lawgiver, a governor of the world.
A more traditional sounding God.
A bit, but it's still framed as moral faith, not knowledge. We're still limited to thinking about God through analogy, never grasping his true nature. It reinforces the practical moral basis for belief.
Got it. So the critiques lay this massive foundation. Then he revisits some of this in other works, like the Prolegomena and his lectures. Any new angles there?
The Prolegomena mostly restates the arguments from the first critique about the limits of knowledge, but it has a really useful discussion on anthropomorphism, using human terms for God.
And we talk about God using our limited concepts.
Exactly. Kant makes this great distinction between dogmatic anthropomorphism, naively thinking God literally has human emotions or limitations, and symbolic anthropomorphism.
What's the difference?
Symbolic is using analogies, like saying God's love is like parental love focused on well-being, but knowing it's not identical, not limited in the same way human love is. It allows us to talk meaningfully about God without pretending we fully understand or, reducing God to human scale.
A way to avoid literalism, but also avoid saying nothing at all.
Precisely. Then the lectures on philosophical theology really hammer home the practical value of theology. Religion, again, is defined as applying theology to morality.
Morality first.
Always. He identifies himself as a theist, believing in a living God, free, moral, holy, just, powerful. But crucially, these are attributes derived from practical reasons needs, not speculative proofs.
Okay. Anything else significant in the lectures?
Well, he does take an early stab at theodicy, the problem of evil. How can a good God allow suffering? His initial ideas weren't super original. Free will causes moral evil. Physical evil pushes us to progress. Imbalances will be fixed later. It shows he's engaging with the issue, though.
But it sounds like he wasn't entirely satisfied with those answers.
No, and his thinking definitely evolved. Later, in an essay called On the Miscarriage of All Philosophical Trials in Theodicy, he basically throws up his hands.
Gives up on solving the problem of evil.
On solving it philosophically, yeah. He concludes that trying to rationally justify God given the existence of evil is doomed to fail. It ultimately comes back to faith, not knowledge.
So another limit placed on reason.
Exactly. And in his later years, he kind of distilled his faith down to 3 core articles. 1, belief in one God as the source of all good. 2, belief that God's purposes can somehow harmonize with our ultimate good. And 3, belief in immortality for our continued moral progress.
A practical faith focused on morality and hope.
Very much so. He even allows for the possibility of divine revelation, but says we can never know if something is truly revelation. Its value is only ever regulative. Does it help us be more moral? Does it edify us?
Which leads us nicely into religion within the limits of reason alone. This feels like a really key text for his mature views.
Oh, absolutely central. Kant saw it as completing his system, answering that final question, what can we reasonably hope for? And he uses this great image of 2 concentric circles.
Right, the inner and outer circles, what do they represent?
The inner circle is the core, pure moral reason, the one true universal religion based on the moral law within us. The outer circle contains all the various historical revealed religions, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, etc.
And the idea is?
The idea is that these historical faiths in the outer circle are valuable only insofar as they are built upon and promote the universal moral principles of the inner circle. Their job is to lead people towards that core moral truth.
Interesting. And he tackles human nature here too, doesn't he? this good versus evil thing within us.
He does. He talks about an innate predisposition to good, but also this radical propensity to evil, not inherited sin like in traditional theology, but a fundamental tendency in human freedom to prioritize our selfish inclinations over the moral law.
Our own choices matter most.
Critically, moral worth comes from freely choosing to follow reason, will, over our desires, willker. And this leads him to distinguish authentic religion from phony religion.
What's the difference for Kant?
Authentic religion is all about virtuous conduct, about living out those moral duties. Phony religion is just outward stuff, rituals, prayers, trying to curry favor with God without actually changing your behavior or inner commitment. He says we can hope for God's grace, but true goodness comes from our own moral effort.
And Jesus, how does he fit into this moral picture?
Jesus becomes the archetype, the perfect ideal of humanity resisting evil and living according to the moral law. Kant focuses almost entirely on Jesus as a moral teacher and example.
But he's cagey about the divinity, miracles.
Very cagey. He doesn't explicitly deny them, but they're not the point for him. The point is the moral teaching. True religious service is following that teaching, striving for moral perfection. Anything else focusing on dogma, rituals for their own sake, that's pseudo-service, even fetishism.
Strong words. He wasn't a fan of clericalism then.
Not at all. He saw it as often promoting pseudo-service over genuine inner change. True godliness for Kant is this inner state. Reverence for the moral law combined with a love for it leading to a goodwill, things like prayer or church, they can be good if they foster that inner commitment within a community. But if they're just about going through the motions to appease God, then they're part of the problem, outer circle stuff without the inner core.
So it really is religion within the limits of reason alone. Morality is the absolute core.
Completely. Universal human reason, expressed in the moral law, is the supreme principle. Historical faiths are vehicles, some better than others perhaps, but morality is the destination.
Okay, that's a powerful, if quite stripped down, view of religion. But then things get even weirder, right?
Yeah.
In the late unfinished Opus Postumum.
Yeah, things get intriguing and difficult to interpret, honestly, because it's fragmentary, written when his health was failing. But the hints are fascinating.
What kind of hints?
He seems to push the connection between moral duty and God even further, almost to the point of identifying God with our concept of moral duty itself.
Wait, God is the moral law, not just the source of it.
It starts to sound that way. Less of a separate transcendent being and more like an immanent principle within our own moral consciousness. He talks about God as the inner vital spirit of man in the world.
Wow, that's a big shift. Almost like God is within us.
It leans that way, influencing later thinkers like Hegel. He even questions whether attributing personality to God is legitimate anymore, moving further from traditional ideas. And there's that eyebrow-raising reference to Spinoza.
The pantheist.
Yeah, Kant quickly distanced himself from it, but he wrote something like, "I am in the supreme being," suggesting this deep interconnection between God, the world, and the self.
And didn't he even suggest God might not be essential to religion at all?
That's perhaps the most radical suggestion, that maybe the concept of God isn't the absolute foundation. It really shows how far his thinking continued to evolve right to the very end.
What an incredible intellectual journey, from rational proofs to moral necessity to, well, something almost mystical or immanent.
It really is astonishing. Tracing that path shows him constantly refining, questioning, pushing the boundaries, from trying to prove God exists, to carving out space for faith by limiting knowledge, to grounding everything in morality, and finally hinting at this God deeply interwoven with our own moral being.
The critique of pure reason definitely feels like the hinge point in that whole story.
Absolutely. It changed the game entirely. And then Religion Within the Limits gives us the clearest picture of where he landed, at least in his mature published work, that ethics-first view of religion.
Definitely the two essential texts to grasp his main arguments on this.
Without a doubt.
So, wrapping up this deep dive, it leaves us with a pretty profound question, doesn't it? Especially considering Kant's final tentative ideas. Is, as he seemed to suggest at the end, the concept of God as a separate being might not even be essential to religion. What is the core? What constitutes the heart of your own understanding, or perhaps our collective understanding of faith and morality? Does morality need a divine lawgiver, or does it stand on its own?
It's a challenge Kant leaves us with, forcing us to think about the deepest connections, or perhaps disconnections, between ethics and belief.
Something to definitely keep pondering. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.
Guys, see you in another podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel.